Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Wild Edibles with Sergei. In today's video, I want to show you my messy room, i.e. take you through my weed-covered garden and do something a little special, a little different. I want to talk about all of the unintentional food that grows in a garden, i.e. wild edibles. So I want to kind of keep it light, I want to keep it fun, I want to show you some of my favorite edible weeds and make an argument for them because they are much easier to grow and quite possibly more nutritious than the plants that we're trying to cultivate. If you're interested in that kind of thing, please do stick around. It should be fun and educational. First things first, let me just give you a tour of this garden. This little garden patch is, nothing super special. This year was a very busy year for all of us, for myself, for Kylie, and we knew we only had a limited amount of energy to throw at a garden, so we made a big push in the spring to plow this land. My neighbor actually came out. We attempted to plow it and his little tractor broke it because the earth was so solid. Then he got mad and went and got his big tractor, brought that back, and it worked like a charm. So we made an initial push to put plants in the ground, and then other things came up, like we got married. Kylie and I tied the knot. That took a lot of time and preparation. We also did things like remodel the kitchen. There's YouTube videos for that. Long story short, there was not a whole lot of time for weeding. And so in effect, I'm showing you my messy room and kind of, you get to see all the chaos. So don't judge me on that, or do. But we're actually gonna turn that weed, that messiness, into a positive thing and talk about the wild edibles. The last thing that I have to mention in every wild edibles video is my little disclaimer. Obviously, when you eat things that are new to you, you have to exercise a degree of caution so that you don't harm yourself, so you stay safe and happy. And so I have 3 really simple rules that'll keep you safe. Rule number 1 is don't eat something if you don't know what it is.
Don't eat something if you don't know what it is.
That's probably like the most common sense rule, because plants can't hurt you unless you physically pick them up and eat them. And so you have to identify a plant before you consume it. That's just common sense. Sergei's rule number 2 is try all new foods in small amounts. So start small. Even though all these plants that I will be discussing are edible, you can't be sure how they affect you the first time you eat them. So just take a little bit of plantain, try it, see how you feel. Then the next day try something else, and so on and so forth. Because when you start that way, you just minimize your risk even further of anything negative happening. And then rule number 3 is don't mix different wild edibles. So when you're learning about wild edibles, you don't want to make a salad from 15 different wild edibles, because if you get a reaction after eating said salad, it's going to be very hard to identify what caused that reaction. So start eating like a mono diet, where you eat common mallow one day and then you put a little bit of clover in a smoothie the next day, and so on and so forth. And then when you're 6 months in or a year in, feel free to start making salads and getting more complex. So it's literally that easy. And on that note, let's talk about plants. Come on. Here you have some tomato plants. Nothing to write home about. And the very first plant that I want to talk about is right here. Oh, I also want to give a big shout out to Levi. I know I'm switching it up all over the place, but Levi, my camera guy, is doing video work again, and I'm so thrilled. Here, let me see that thing real quick. Give me that fig rig.
Oh, what?
Look at this guy. Look at him.
Didn't do my hair.
Thanks for helping me film, buddy.
Yeah, I love
it. Okay, so most people are going to know this plant right here. This is a dandelion, and it's thriving in between rows of tomatoes that we planted. And dandelion is probably the most common weed on this earth. Dandelions are very good for your inner organs, your pancreas, your liver, your stomach. They're very bitter to the taste, so a lot of people don't like eating them, but there's tricks to that, namely throwing these in green smoothies or blending them with some sort of fat, whether that's butter or olive oil, like in a pesto. That fat will actually cut the bitter taste. And on a dandelion, all the parts are edible. The leaves, the flowers, there are no flowers here. Even these white milky saps that's edible too. That bitterness in that white sap is actually what's most beneficial for you. It's like the lifeblood of the plant. And the easiest way to identify a dandelion, apart from the yellow flower that we all know and love, is by the leaf. It's going to be kind of jagged, sometimes lobed, but it's also going to have a smooth main stem. In fact, dandelions have a lot of lookalikes, but a true dandelion will always have a smooth stem. I gotta take off these shoes. Get all natural. You guys don't mind, do you? If I get comfortable in my own garden, probably the best way to identify dandelions is by their yellow flowers. They're unmistakingly dandelion, and most people know what those look like. These flowers are super edible, and I have videos about how to use them. You can put them in honey and make like a wild edible jelly, wildflower jelly, or you can just pluck them and throw them in salads. They taste delicious. They actually concentrate vitamin D. So if you're somebody that's lacking in that, maybe you're feeling a little grumpier than usual, you can add a little dandelion into your life in the form of a flower, and it'll boost your vitamin D levels. And while we're here, it's worth noting that dandelion roots, you can make dandelion root coffee from it. I did this experiment a couple years ago, so I have a video about that as well. And so if you ever want to make a non-caffeinated dandelion beverage, coffee-like beverage, go and check that out. You know, things like dandelion, already you just increase your yield by one plant. And this stuff is super duper nutritious. They sell a bunch of this stuff at a health food store for about $4. So right here, I just made $4. And I can maybe just walk along and put some in the basket so that we can all see by the end of this how bountiful wild edibles can be. And another good tip is to harvest wild edibles. It's also nice to have a pair of scissors because you can just snip, snip, snip. And then it's a lot easier than just pulling them. All right, come on. The next plant we're going to talk about is this plant. It's literally taking over my garden this year. This is called green amaranth. And this is a huge plant. You'll see it over and over again, from little to tall. This is an edible wild relative of your traditional amaranth. Amaranth is like a quinoa grain that's much finer that people cook. And this is the wild version of it. This plant is incredibly nutritious. It's not too chlorophyll-y to the taste, so it's very easy to eat, especially for people that don't like that rich green taste. And it can be used in a plethora of ways. You can add it to soups, salads, you know, you could eat it raw. It's just a very delicious, nutritious plant. This plant has a lot of K vitamins. It's loaded with minerals. John Kalis, one of my wild edibles teachers, he says that this is one of the healthiest plants that you can eat. You know, maybe now is a good time to also mention my little spiel on meristems and meristematic bits. So with a plant like green amaranth, obviously it gets really tall. And the bigger that a plant gets, the less nutritious it also gets, because it has to take all those carbohydrates and sugars that carry all the nutrients, and it has to push them up further up the stem. And so when you're picking wild edibles for food, you're gonna have a much better, more pleasant experience if you pick either baby greens, like when plants are small, or you go through a plant and pick off the tender bits, the small bits. You know, right here, boom, let's do that one. These are known as the meristematic parts, i.e. the growing parts of a plant. And so while the entire plant is edible, while I can eat this, this is what I'm after right here. So where's my little bowl? So when you harvest amaranth, you just kind of throw it in your little bowl. So when it's young, it does have some non-edible relatives, which is to say like plants in the nightshade family, plants that kind of look like wild tomatoes. And so you do have to exercise some caution, but one of the best ways to identify amaranth is by its seed pod. This amaranth seed pod is unique to this plant. And so when you're learning about amaranth in the beginning, you may not want to pick it at this stage. You may want to wait until it grows a little bit taller and develops a sure sign that it's amaranth. And then you can go through and pick the meristematic bits, and you can even compost the rest. All right, on we go. This next plant is one of my favorites. This right here is called common mallow or malva. And this plant is essentially a wild okra. Let's get some more. So like okra, it has gelatinous consistencies to it. It's kind of, you know, it thickens stuff. And perhaps that's why in the olden days they used to use it to make marshmallows, because that gelatinous compound thickens. I don't actually know how they made marshmallows, to be honest. I have no idea, but I know that they used to add this stuff to the recipe to thicken it. So this is one of my favorite wild edibles. I probably say that about every wild edible, but with this one I actually mean it. It's got a very gentle taste to it. You know, you can plop it in your mouth raw and it just tastes like a nice vegetable. This plant is great in soups. It's amazing in smoothies because of its thickening qualities. And so whenever I'm out in the garden picking stuff for salads, I always make sure to add common mallow into the mix. And earlier I mentioned that it's nice to harvest with scissors, and this is precisely why, because you can just come in here and mow it down. And you don't even have to be crazy about picking out the stems. All the parts are edible. Let me see if I can actually find a nice sprawling plant. Yeah, it kind of grows almost like a nasturtium, where it spreads out from its roots, and all of these parts are edible. In fact, eventually it will develop these button-like fruits right here, and those add just like a nice texture to a salad. They're almost like a little caper or something, so I make sure and I put those in my salads as well. And so we could just take our scissors, snip some of the leaves in the bowl. It's not an exact science, feel free to improvise. And this stuff we can compost, but while I have the roots in my hand, I might as well just throw in a little bit of good practice conservation when harvesting wild edibles. Now for weeds, it's not so much of an issue because you don't want them in your garden, you want to get rid of them. So you don't really have to apply what I'm about to say to garden weeds. But when you're harvesting wild edibles, it's a good idea to leave the root intact so that you don't kill the plant and don't damage a population. And so if this was not a common plant that I knew was a weed, if I was harvesting this for the first time, I would be very inclined just to snip around, grab the leaves, but leave the root in the ground. So that's just kind of wild edibles good practices. Look at this thing right here. As I pick out more roots. This is a collard green. So this is not a wild edible, it's just like this collard green that I planted, but for some reason it wasn't doing so good, and so it just looked like a sow thistle to me. One thing I do want to point out, since I have this in my hands, is wild edibles often have much longer root systems than domesticated plants. Let me see if I can illustrate that real quick. Let's grab a green amaranth, right? So here is, I'm not really comparing apples to apples, but maybe you'll get the point nonetheless. So here's a domestic collard green, and you can kind of see how big its root structure is. And here is a wild amaranth, and you can see how big its root structure is. Let me zoom in there a little bit. And the point I want to make about roots is that when a plant is genetically healthier, it's going to have bigger roots. The roots are going to be able to reach further into soil to draw out vital vitamins and minerals. And wild edibles just do this better innately. And so while this collard green is kind of stunted and I have to baby it in order for it to get to that, this wild amaranth, meanwhile, has long root systems and is just designed to thrive. So, you know, literally this amaranth is thriving everywhere, and I'm sitting here having to baby this houseplant. So long story short, because of these longer roots, wild edibles often have a higher density of minerals and vitamins, and so they're, in my book, actually more sought after, because if you're looking for health, if you're growing an organic garden to be healthier, you don't want to not eat this, because that will make you healthier. Okay, on we go. Look at this madness right here. Here's a good example of the lack of weeding that exists in my garden today. This is absolutely ridiculous. So right here in this mess, there's a couple things to talk about. First, there's all types of different grass. Believe it or not, these are wild edibles as well. Probably one of the most prevalent wild edibles around. And grasses, they're extremely nutritious. People like Ann Wigmore in the past have just revolutionized the health food movement by juicing this stuff, by blending this stuff. And if you go to a health food store to get a shot of wheatgrass, that little shot's gonna be like $4 or $5. So why not just harvest a bunch of this stuff from your organic garden for free? You know, it hasn't been sprayed by pesticides because it's your garden. And you can literally juice this stuff and make your own wheatgrass. Or if you don't want to juice it, you can throw a handful in a smoothie and it will literally pulverize the fibrous bits of this grass, especially if you're using like a Vitamix or a high-powered blender, and then you're getting the benefit from a weed that you hated. So in effect, you are shifting your perspective from hating weeds, from them being a plague in your garden, to them being a blessing. So wild grass is another good edible to know about. In between the grass, there's also little clovers. And these garden grown clovers are so tender. They're like the best kinds of pea shoots. Clovers are in the pea family. And so, you know, many of us will go to the store, and when we're feeling fancy, we'll buy microgreens, and sometimes those microgreen mixes will have pea shoots in them. Anybody that's ever done that has known that that is not cheap to do. Those mixes are expensive. And yet in your garden, more than likely, you have wild clovers growing, and they're absolutely edible, easy to eat raw. Again, you can throw them in soup, salads, sandwiches, stews. So clover, let's just quickly talk about how to ID a clover. And this might warrant a tight shot. All clovers have 3 leaves generally. Unless you're lucky, then they have 4. And they're also going to have this discoloration on the leaf, like a little crescent shape. So those are all great identifying characteristics. And then another thing that some people don't know is that if you look really closely at the edge of the leaf, it's slightly serrated. So that too can be a good identifying factor for a clover. And then of course, clover flower is probably the best identifier. We don't have any here, but I can see just down the way that there's some clover flowers, which, you know, are just about the best way that you can identify this plant. One of my wild edibles teachers, a lady named Karen Sherwood, she runs an organization called Earthwalk Northwest. She taught me all about clovers, and she taught me a very important lesson. She said, if you want to learn a plant well for the rest of your life, it's really easy to do. All you have to do is sit down with it and describe it to yourself. If you do that, if you spend a few minutes doing that, you'll never forget the plant. And she did that after she sent me out to find clover in her garden during a wild edibles workshop that I was taking. And I got so frustrated because I couldn't find any clover anywhere. It was literally invisible to me. So I came back empty-handed. I didn't have my basket of clovers like she asked. And she sent me back and said, this time, get on your hands and knees, get close, take a deep breath, take your time, and look again. And so I did what she said, came back, got down on my hands and knees, slowed down a little bit, and realized that I couldn't find clover in a clover field. It was literally all around me, and I was literally just not in the right mindset to find it. And so just being out here, just digging, just doing this like I'm doing on the camera right now, it's a great way to bathe yourself in nature, to get some nature therapy. And especially in this crazy world in 2021 where like literally worlds are colliding and things just keep on happening, it's nice to come out here and just get a little sanity and remember that there's a whole microcosm right here of crickets and animals and fauna and flora, and they're all living happily and peacefully, and that just makes me happy every time I come out here. So thank you, Karen, if you're watching this video. I still remember your lessons, and the point that I was trying to make but kind of went off on a tangent is if you sit down with clover and really describe it to yourself, as with any one of these plants, you'll remember it for the rest of your life. So that's how you identify clover. Another thing I want to show you while we're here is these crazy things.
Holy moly.
So these are some sort of radish or turnip, which are growing in my garden, but I didn't plant them. And so I don't know if they're wild. I don't know if maybe they came from the goat manure that I used when I tilled this field. They look really gnarly, but they're super delicious. And they're obviously in the radish family, in the mustard family. But you know, I just kind of rolled with it, didn't plant anything in this bed, and these radishes started popping up. And in a sense, they're wild to me because I didn't intend for them to be here. You know, there's a good quote about a weed. A weed is any plant that grows where it's not intended. So these are a weed to me. But it's also a nice reminder that not only are the roots edible, the radish bits, but you can also eat the greens. All mustards are edible. They have a very mustardy smell, and a radish is a mustard. So if you want to identify a true mustard, you can just crunch up a leaf, and if it smells like mustard, give that a sniff. Then it's a mustard. And there you go. Give it a snifferoo. Here's another interesting thing. So all mustards, wild or domestic, they have these flowers that have 4 petals, and they kind of look like little broccolinis, broccolettes. And so if you crush these things up and smell them, they smell just like mustard too, the little flower bits.
Macro focus.
And that's, I think, why we have 5 senses, because we're not supposed to just experience this world with 1 sense or 2 senses. Some plants are going to be much easier to identify with your sense of smell. So another thing I often rant about on my wild edibles talks is really learn, touch, feel, smell, listen, because that's how you're going to get the most out of your learning. You know, don't just describe a mustard to yourself. Crush up the leaf. What does it smell like? And see if it makes you salivate. A lot of plants that are very edible will elicit like a saliva response. You're gonna get hungry when you smell them. And then a lot of poisonous plants, when you smell them, it's like, blech, disgusting, get it away from me. So that is a mechanism in the plant that's telling you, do not eat me. I do not want to be eaten. And then there's a mystery to Sergei. This plant right here. It looks like something in between maybe a wild sunflower or like a dock. And I've been trying to identify this, but I don't know what it is yet. You know, it's a foreign plant to me. So I've tried through books, tried a Google reverse search image, posted on a couple forums, and then I even tried out that app, Plant ID, but I was not able to find what this is. So if you're out there and you're watching this and you have experience with this plant, shoot me a comment below. I'm interested to know what it is. It's literally everywhere. It came up as like a cover crop, and it's all around. Oh, let's come over here. In the shade. Look at this little baby. This plant right here is known as prickly lettuce. And judging by that name, some people might think it's not good to eat because of that, but don't be fooled by prickles. Often prickles grow on things that are very delicious. So this is the origin of all lettuces. You know, 5,000–10,000 years ago, when romaine lettuce didn't exist, this was growing all over the place, and this is what people ate. And through cultivation and hybridization, people were able to extract something that looks very different to this, which is, you know, the common lettuces that you could get in a store. And even though they did that, the makeup of this plant still resembles something that's familiar, right? I mean, doesn't this kind of look like an endive or something maybe that you could get at a co-op?
I've actually got my romaine, if I let it go too long, starts getting smutty like that. It seems like other salads.
Perfect. So that's a great point. So if you let your romaine bolt and go to seed, the top of it will start looking like this. So this is another dandelion relative. It's got that white sap that's good for your inner organs. You know, if you're a diabetic, this stuff is great for your pancreas, just for like helping, you know, if you have type 2 diabetes, for example, and your pancreas does produce some insulin, this will help it just work through sugars better and stuff. I know it's a big, bold claim, but I've seen it work with my own 2 eyes over and over again. So, you know, how do you eat prickly lettuce? When it's young, the prickles are very minuscule, and, you know, it's not really an issue. If you blend them or put them in a salad or maybe steam this plant, you won't even notice them. But as it matures and gets taller, the prickles will form to be a little bit more fibrous. And so you literally just either have to boil this plant or blend it to pulverize it, and then the prickles are a good thing because they're just added fiber and they don't affect you in any way. So this is a great herb to throw in soups, and I would literally just eat it just like that. You know, cut it, maybe slice it a couple times. It reduces quite a bit when it's cooked, so it'll shrink and become kind of like a boiled collard green. So that's a great plant to know, prickly lettuce. We have all kinds of squash and watermelon planted here. It's obviously loving the heat. In Oregon, we've been getting triple-digit temperatures for like 25 days. We just beat our record. It's also on fire, so if you see a little bit of smoke behind me, it's because everything is burning again. And we're just making the best do that we can, trying to stay positive. And digging in the garden again helps me be that way. So we just talked about mustards, different radishes. Here's a wild growing mustard. We have one, and you can tell just by looking at it that the flower structure is very similar to the radishes we discussed, and they're going to grow in little clusters at the top. And so if we dig a little bit, boom, we can see that this plant looks very different to the radish. But once again, we could test whether or not it's a true mustard by crumpling the leaves, smelling it, and it smells like mustard. So this is an edible plant, very delicious, very nutritious, and all parts are edible. But again, we're after the meristematic bits, which means the tender leaves and the flowers. And this plant is very spicy, so you probably don't want to use it in a sweet green smoothie or like a sweet fruit salad, but it would be very delicious in like a salsa or a burrito, just to add a little bit of spice, maybe some sushi, you name it. There's a wide array of ways to eat this plant. Right down the way from the mustard we just talked about, here's another dandelion relative. This is called a sow thistle, and it's another great soup herb, very edible. As you can tell, it's getting to be a little prickly. Same with some of the other plants we discussed, which was the prickly lettuce. And so this might not be a great candidate for eating in a salad, but it's a very great candidate for boiling, roasting, steaming. It's a very tender green once you boil down the spines, and it just adds texture to your food. Like this little flower that hasn't bloomed yet, that's another little caper-like vegetable. So right there, you know, we're just cruising around. We're just kind of goofing off today, but already I picked almost an entire bowl of stuff that people could weed and throw in their compost and not even think twice about. But this might be one of the most nutritious salads I've ever had. So there's a lot of value in it. Okay, on we go. Oh, check it out, more plantain. It's easy to get distracted. So we were talking about plantain at the very beginning. No, we didn't talk about plantain.
I don't know if we did.
Yeah. So right next to the sow thistle, we have this amazing plant. This is called plantain, and I've often ranted about this plant on YouTube because every wild edible superhero should have this plant on their belt, because this plant can literally save your life. And it can save your life by, sorry, I keep changing levels on you. Why don't I just sit down and shut up? So this plant right here is called lance leaf plantain. Lance because the leaves are long, lance shaped. There's also broadleaf plantain, which has bigger leaves. But this plant right here draws out toxins through the skin. So if you ever get bit by something, if you're allergic to bee stings, for example, you can just crush up this plant, chew it up, and apply it topically, and it'll start alleviating the swelling, the pain, and just help you out in a good way. And so this plant right here, we all need to know about, especially people with kids. You know, your kid gets stung, they're crying, they're making a scene. I've done this to my friends' kids. You just chew up a little plantain, apply it to the bee sting, and a few moments later, it doesn't even hurt anymore. And the kid is like, wow, you just performed sorcery. You just performed magic. So this is a great plant to know. It's also edible. It's gonna have a bit more of a chlorophyll taste. This is more of like an advanced green. You don't want to give this to somebody that doesn't like the taste of greens because it's pretty intense, but it's edible. It's full of good stuff. In my book, I have all kinds of charts and stuff about the nutritional makeup of all the plants that we've talked about. From the top of my head, I believe it's rich in potassium and calcium, manganese, and I believe it has A, C, and K vitamins. And plantain is also where psyllium husk comes from. These little seed pods that plantain produces, they have a lot of husks on them. One plantain plant can produce up to 15,000 seeds, and these little husks are literally what's ground up to make psyllium husk, which is a digestive aid and a natural vegetable plant-based gelatin. And so if you have digestion issues, you can eat the entire plant because it's as good, if not better, than this stuff, or you could just grind up some of the seed pods in your smoothie and use it to improve your digestion. It's as simple as that. So this is, you know, definitely top 10. This is just a home remedy, like a rescue remedy plant that everybody should know about. And it's literally rampant. In fact, in this field that we're sitting in, I've now been mowing this field for about 6 months, and a couple times the entire field has changed plants. At one point it was thistle, then the thistle died and it was mustard, and then at one point the entire field was plantain, which was really cool. And then I mowed it down and grass grew back. So it's really interesting when you're digging in a garden and really paying attention to see how different plants will come through there, then go away. Other plants will come through there and go away. It kind of makes me think that nature intended for us to eat seasonally, because if we were living off the land and planes didn't exist and cars didn't exist, we would literally eat a plant until it was out of season, and then we'd be forced to eat a different plant and a different plant and a different plant. And that would be a natural rotation in our diet. So I think there's benefit in that. We would be eating more variety, and we would also not be accumulating any one alkaloid, because all greens, they have trace amounts of alkaloids or toxic substances in them. And those toxic substances are a survival mechanism so that no one plant gets exterminated. And so when sometimes people complain that green smoothies led to less than ideal health results or side effects, it often is the result of just eating kale day in and out every single day for a year or two. And that's not natural. We're supposed to rotate our diets and eat a wide array of diets. Eat kale one day, then sow thistle the next day, then something else the next day. And so that's healthier and that's also safer. So diversity is the spice of life. I think we have maybe 2 more plants and then we'll wrap it up because it's getting hot. I think right here, this is it. This is my watermelon patch. Watermelon's not doing so good this year. And in fact, I've never really had luck growing watermelons. So I don't really try too hard. I just threw them in. Thought, hey, if I get 1 or 2 good watermelons, I'll be happy with that. Once again, we didn't have too much time for gardening this year. But right next to the watermelon is something equally impressive. It's this plant right here. And it's called Purslane. Purslane is a heart-healthy plant. Kind of looks like a succulent. It also has that okra gelatinous consistency to it. Some people don't like the sliminess, but it thickens things up. So once again, it's good for soups, it's good for smoothies. If you don't like smoothies that separate, throw this stuff in there and it'll keep it bound together. And this stuff is just good for reducing cholesterol, good for strengthening the heart. It's got omega-3s in it, one of the few plants out there that is rich in omega-3s. And it's got a very pleasant lemony taste to it. And so how do you identify it? First of all, the position of the plant often tells you a lot. This is a creeping, sprawling plant that grows under things and it just spreads out. It kind of looks like a succulent. And then it has little flowers that have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. And the petals are cleft, which means there's a little slice in them. So 5 petals and each petal is cleft. This one has some kind of funk on it. So obviously you'd get a little picky and you would use nice leaves. But you throw a little bit of that in a salad, a couple handfuls, and it's just crisp, it adds texture, it's nice and lemony to the taste, and people will just think, wow, what kind of gourmet salad am I eating? Where did you get this stuff? And then the thicker stems, you don't have to, those are like your okras. Those are the things you would use in soups, maybe roasted veggies. I throw them in smoothies. I throw everything in smoothies, but these are especially good in smoothies. And so every day when I'm out here picking, whether it's domesticated, cultivated plants or wild edibles, I always take some of this purslane because I know how valuable it is in its nutritional makeup. And it's all over the place. You know, we have one bed of it here. We have another bed of it here. Here's a funny thing to look at right here. So check it out. We have this malva, which we already talked about, which is that wild okra relative, and it's thriving. And then right next to it, we have actual okra, which I planted about a week ago, and it's not doing so hot right now. I don't know if it's too hot or maybe I shocked the plant when I transplanted it, but I'm trying really hard to grow okra when I didn't try at all and wild okra just grew. Which makes me think that sometimes, why do I bother? Why wouldn't I just till this land next year, let the weeds do their own thing and just have a garden full of nutritious wild greens and then I wouldn't have to tend to any of this. But the reason for having this is because it brings me a lot of joy. You come out here, you take care of something, you have a higher purpose that's not just you. And then at the end of the year, things grow and it just gives me a nice sense of fulfillment, a sense that I did something important. And I also get to feed my wife, my friends, my acquaintances, just feed everybody. And the last plant that I want to talk about is slightly limpy and gimpy. It's this lamb's quarters right here.
Spin around on you.
Levi and I have filmed lots of lamb's quarters in my day, and I have better videos about this plant on YouTube. There's literally only one lamb's quarters in my garden right now. This is actually a quinoa relative. It's Synapodium. Quinoa is Synapodium quinoa, the Latin name, and this is Synapodium album, I believe. And so, you know, if you want to eat quinoa, local quinoa, really just eat lamb's quarters. Because it has all the same nutritional benefits. But the reason this plant looks so limpy is because Kylie, without thinking about it, grabbed it and weeded it the other day. And I was like, baby, what are you doing? I meant to film that. That's the only one. And so then we came over and transplanted it here near water, and it's not doing so hot. So unfortunately, I don't know, maybe we should just skip this plant because it's too wilty to really identify. But for those interested, lamb's quarters always has like a little fine dust on the tops of its leaves, and that's a good identifying characteristic. Sometimes this dust is white, sometimes it's purple, sometimes it's a hue in between those two. But this is essentially a wild spinach. It's in the goosefoot family, and if this was thriving and abundant, I would literally just come through and pick all the tender bits and throw those in a burrito, because this is good eating right here. Right over here, here's another specimen of common mallow, and this one is starting to flower. It's a good opportunity to show my viewers what that looks like. So malva will develop these pinkish, whitish flowers, and those will eventually turn into little buttons that are really tasty in salads. But this right here is another great way to identify the mallow. You're going to look for those, what kind of shape is that? Like pentagon shaped leaves, lobed leaves. And then you're going to look for pink flowers. And these flowers are really good garnishes. So you can put them on salads, on burritos, on anything you want to make fancy. You can even make ice cubes with wild flower petals in them. And I have a video about that I'll link below this video. So check that out. And they just make really nice fancy ice cubes that you can add to cocktails or mocktails. And all of your guests will just, as they say in Russia, be peeing hot water. Pissing boiling water, to be exact. Check it out.
Sounds like something I wouldn't want to do.
Yeah, you know, maybe that saying doesn't translate that well. But you know, like in Russian, peeing hot water means like you got so excited that your water boiled and then you peed boiling water. So
Gotcha.
Maybe it gets lost in translation. Yeah. You're right.
I'm envisioning through my perspective of my college days and peeing hot water in college.
Yeah, probably not a good idea. Different cultures.
Different people.
My point is that you'll get really excited.
You can edit that out, right?
I'm gonna keep that in. Check it out. So we've been out here, who knows how many minutes, but we picked a whole bowl of food, and all this food is free and unintentional, meaning I didn't plant any of it. It came up on its own. So my main objective in this video, apart from teaching people some more wild edibles and weeds, is to inspire you to let some weeds grow to see what they turn into, because quite possibly those weeds will transform into delicious, nutritious edibles that will diversify your food. And that's super duper cool. And it's literally quality that you cannot buy at the store. It's something that only people with gardens or tilled up earth have access to. And there's heaps of it to go around. So if you don't have your own earth, more than likely one of your friends has a garden, and you can go dig through that and look for some of these plants. On that note, I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching. I have heaps more wild edibles resources out there. There's more videos on YouTube. I'll link to all those in the description below. I also have a wild edibles book. I think it's a really good book. I wrote every single word in that book. So it's been thoroughly vetted by me, and it's available everywhere which in today's world just means that it's sold on Amazon. So head to Amazon, get it there if you want, or not. That's it, that's all. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.
Oh, I forgot to hit record.
Perfect, take 2.